Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where we will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so we can move through our pain and get the kind of healthy relationships we want, need, and deserve. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based out of Oakland, California. And while I hope that you find this podcast educational, informational, and entertaining, please note that it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, some of the information discussed in this podcast may be sensitive in nature to some of my listeners. So please note that you can skip ahead or you can wait to listen to the podcast at a later time whenever you're ready. Thank you so much for listening to the show today. I'm happy to be here with you. I have a very special guest indeed for you today. Today's guest that I have coming on the show today is Dr. Earl Turner. Dr. Earl is a licensed clinical psychologist and a psychology professor in Houston, Texas. He's a contributor to Psychology Today. He's one of the very few African American contributors to the Psychology Today blog. He's earned his PhD in clinical psychology from Texas A&M University. And he's also coming out with his very own podcast, The Breakdown with Dr. Earl. He's Today, on today's show, he's going to be talking about his work with underserved African American families that are ran by single parents. And we talk about absenteeism and how it affects the child and the home and what type of concepts they develop around male and female figures as a result of being raised in a single parent home, and how that can influence them being more likely or more susceptible to being in unhealthy relationships as an adult. He drops a lot of knowledge, so have a listen. Hello, Dr. Earl. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
All right. I appreciate you so much for wanting to do this podcast interview. We kind of met in an interesting way on Instagram. So it's interesting how those things kind of work out sometimes. But I was really impressed with your work, and I thought that you would be the perfect guest to come on the show.
Well, I'm excited to be here, so thank you for...
Awesome. And so, Dr. Earl, for folks in my audience that are not familiar with you and your work, can you tell us a little bit about you and what you do and what drives your passion?
Sure. So I am a clinical psychologist by training, primarily working with families, children and adolescents with a number of different mental health and psychological conditions. But I'm also primarily a faculty person, a professor at a university here in Houston, Texas. And my research looks at mental health use among African American and Latino populations. And I also provide some leadership service to the profession through a number of different organizations. And most of their work is centered on diversity issues and addressing mental health among people of color.
That's amazing. And what started your passion behind that? I'm a little bit curious, especially when you talk about your work with children and families.
Yeah, so when I was in undergrad, I began to become interested in psychology. I actually started college majoring pre-medicine microbiology because I was interested in being a pediatrician at the time. And I actually took a child psychology class, and then that sort of sparked my interest in psychology and working with children. And I changed my major to psychology and began to focus on that area. And during that time, I also started working with one of the professors at the university that I attended, Louisiana State University. And she was doing some work with children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And we were working in a low-income clinic providing treatment to that population, which happened to provide a lot of services to African-American kids. And one of the things that struck me was that a lot of kids had been maybe having some of these difficulties for a very long time without getting any sort of help. And so I really began to be curious about sort of this idea of providing information and resources to families of color about psychology and about mental health treatment, with the hopes that we can really learn to sort of get these kids in sooner than later to address these mental health difficulties, because we know that untreated mental health difficulties and challenges lead to significant challenges later in life in terms of like school and academic performance, but also as the person becomes an adult and sort of not learning how to cope with a number of different issues, or even developing more serious psychological concerns because those that they may have experienced during childhood were not treated. And so I decided to go to graduate school to be a child psychologist, and I really wanted to focus in on addressing mental health within underserved and ethnic minority populations.
Ooh, that's fantastic. And that's so admirable. And it's interesting, we both kind of started out similarly in that I also majored in biology and chemistry with the aspiration to become a medical doctor. And then, so that's pretty interesting. Um, Okay. So as my specialty is working with victims of narcissistic abuse, women who have a history of being in toxic and abusive relationships. And you wanted to come on here today to talk about single or absentee parenting. And I definitely think the two topics oftentimes go hand in hand. Tell me a little bit about your work, because you said that a lot of people have been asking you about single or absentee parenting and some of the issues that have been coming up around that.
Yeah, and so a lot of my work from like my clinical background really came from working in inner city populations. Particularly when I was living and working in Baltimore
Oh,
for
yeah.
years, that there was a high number of households where there were majority single mothers raising kids, and sometimes having some challenges about either if they wanted the father to be involved in the parenting, but also sort of thinking about sort of raising boys and sort of what that means for them as a single mother, and having concerns about that. And this is probably something that a lot of families and parents are sort of familiar with, if not for themselves, but for maybe other family members that may be raising kids by themselves, is that it's difficult and it's challenging, and parenting itself is challenging. And I always, when I'm working with families, talk about, it would really be nice if there was like a handbook that came, yeah, the child, but that's not the case, and every child is different. And so for a lot of single parents, it's really sort of scary to sort of how do you navigate that, and how do you raise kids that are well-rounded and that can grow up to be healthy adults. And so a lot of my work has really been working with kids with severe disruptive behavior issues, oppositional defiant difficulties. And so those are things that are probably extra challenging for parents, either moms or dads that are sort of raising kids on their own, to sort of learn how to address those things, but also make sure that the child is well adjusted.
Okay, so you mentioned the word oppositional defiant, and I think you and I both know what that means, but for some of my listeners, they may not know what oppositional defiant disorder is. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how that shows up in kids, and if that shows up a little bit differently in boys versus girls?
Yeah, so oppositional defiant disorder itself is a psychological condition that is characterized by having a number of different symptoms, which may include like anger towards others, even anger towards adults, rule breaking behaviors, vandalism, skipping school. So those are just some of the key sort of symptoms of the condition. But I think outside of having a disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, that kids can tend to be just oppositional in general, particularly when they become teenagers. I think for a lot of parents, that's probably
Absolutely.
most challenging times of having kids, because they are learning to sort of be adults and be independent. And as a parent, you sort of want the best for your child and sometimes restrict certain things for them. And so they sort of fight for some of their independence, which can lead to some sort of difficulties in terms of parenting. But I think in terms of like, you brought up the question about differences across boys and girls. I think there are probably more similarities than differences in terms of oppositional behavior. I think that we may sort of, boys may sort of be characterized as engaging in maybe more oppositional behaviors than girls. And so that's sort of just a gender norm in how we socialize kids, that it's a little bit more acceptable for boys to sort of engage in rule breaking than it is for girls. And I think there's sort of a little bit of a double standard sometimes in terms of how we let boys get away with certain things that maybe girls may be reprimanded a little bit more for during their childhood. But I think in general that there are a lot of similarities between those things, and girls may sort of typically maybe engage in less of sort of the vandalism sorts of behaviors or rule breaking behaviors compared to boys. But in general, there are a lot of similarities.
Okay. And thank you so much for explaining that to the audience. And I'm curious, in your work with inner city families, can you talk a little bit about why do you feel like there's single versus inconsistent parenting? Why is that an issue?
I don't know if it's specific to sort of single parents in inner cities.
Okay.
I definitely think that there are probably more challenges sometimes as a single parent, because you are sort of navigating not only raising a family, but also sort of the demands of being an adult and having a career and a job. And so trying to balance that sometimes can be difficult if you don't have a support system to sort of help you out with that. And so I think typically for a lot of families that are in inner cities, and for those that are single parents, is that you may not have as much of a support system in terms of another parent in the home to sort of help you balance some of that. And so you may sort of find yourself maybe being more restrictive on your kid in certain ways because of sort of concerns about safety. And others may not sort of understand some of those challenges about why you may sort of restrict, where your kid can go and how much time they can be away in the community, as opposed to if you were not in the inner city, or if there were two parents in the household, it may be sort of a little bit more flexibility in terms of who can be around to sort of manage and keep an eye out on the kid, as opposed to if it's just you, then sort of you have to always be on watch for what your kid is doing.
Okay. And are you able to give some examples of maybe some more of the restrictiveness that we might see?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I've sort of experienced a lot in terms of my clinical work with families, particularly those in inner cities that may be sort of single parents, is that, let's say if you have a kid who is in middle school and maybe they want to go to the park, and maybe the park is maybe not be perceived as maybe the safest place given
Absolutely
in the community, that you may sort of feel like, well, your kid can only go to the park at a certain time of day, maybe after school for a certain number of hours when you may be able to sort of be home, and so you know that they are ready to come back. But sort of maybe they have friends that sort of maybe don't have those restrictions, and so you maybe get some sort of pushback from your kid about, well, if my friend can do this, why can't I sort of do it? And I think it's sort of leads the parent to be in a position where they maybe have to be more tough on their kid. And so you may sort of get some more of that sort of opposition sort of behaviors from the child.
Mm. And in your experience, and I hear you saying the um, oppositional defiant disorder. Do you feel like, in your experience in working with these families, that becomes more of an issue with single parent or inconsistent parenting in the home?
Yeah, well, I think that it can be more of an issue because how do you manage some of that if the um, child is sort of being oppositional and you have no one, like you have to go manage other things like going to work, and they may have to be sort of maybe unmonitored for a certain period of
Mm-hmm.
time, hours, because you have to get home. Um, is that you if the kid is in opposition against your rules and maybe they don't come right home after school, and you sort of expect them to be there doing homework or something like that, those are some challenges that you sort of may not be prepared to sort of deal with if you don't have that support system or another parent in the home that can sort of be there to sort of address those sort of issues and what are the rules in terms of if the child is not home, and break those rules sort of. Those may be some of the dilemmas, but I think it also sometimes may help with increasing consistency because then you know that you are the enforcer, the primary enforcer in terms of rules in the home.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes if there are two parents, they're not always on the same page about what's the sort of way to sort of manage a child that may be sort of oppositional. And so I think it's sort of there pros and cons, I would say, I guess, that sometimes comes along with when you're parenting as a single parent.
Absolutely. And can you talk a little bit about what sort of challenges little boys or boys face versus girls? And I know I'm using the traditional masculine feminine to refer to gender and things like that, and so I'll just stick with that for simplicity's sake for the show. But can you talk about some of the challenges or maybe more of the impact that young boys and young girls face as a result of single parenting?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the probably bigger concerns in terms of my own experience with families is that oftentimes it tends to be a single mom that's raising
Mm-hmm.
kid, and maybe she only has a boy, and maybe she has a boy and a son and a daughter. But I think sometimes moms have concerns about, are there where are where is their son going to have appropriate models of how they should behave as a
Mm-hmm.
and sort of going into adulthood. And I think sometimes a lot of single moms have concerns and fears about that. And many moms do a great job of raising boys. And sure, we can all sort of identify several different models of people that, have really great careers and that are really, great people that have been raised by single moms. But there are some moms that are concerned about, there isn't a, father in the home, or, maybe the father, for whatever reason, decides that maybe he's remarried or has another family or other kids. And so making sure that, she's raising her son in a way that she wants him to grow up as an adult. And I think for when you're raising girls, that it tends to be easier as a mom, particularly because you can sort of be that model for her, and sort of how you behave is going to be picked up on from her as a child, and for any kid, we know that they pick up on models in their environment in terms of how.
Mm-hmm.
So I always talk with parents about those models may, of course, be you as a parent, but they also have other models that they may, pick up on things from, television, movies, people in their community. particularly if you're involved in church. They have opportunities to model certain behaviors or identify certain strengths or characteristics of people that they're around in those situations. And so I always encourage, single moms to sort of find those opportunities where they can have sort of male role models, or getting them involved in some sort of mentorship program as a way to sort of strengthen those sort of relationships, to sort of help you but not replace you as a parent, but also sort of help as a way to provide that environment where they can sort of maybe talk about things that maybe you as a mom maybe don't want to talk with your sons about, or maybe you feel like your son is not going to be comfortable discussing certain things with you. So sort of providing those opportunities where they can have other models and interactions with positive role models.
Fair enough. And in your experience, in terms of single parenting, it sounds like from what you're saying that most children are in most of the families that you work with in terms of single or perhaps absentee parenting are usually being raised by their mothers.
Oftentimes, and I've definitely had situations where I've had single fathers that I've worked with as well. But I think the majority, at least in my own experience, is primarily been single mothers.
Okay.
If you're in a situation.
Okay. And then, and you were talking about also too some of the concerns that single mothers have, particularly when they have boys, in terms of finding male role models or men that they can look up to kind of know how to move in relationships or how they can handle certain problems that men face, particularly men of color. And you mentioned a couple of places, but I am curious about that. Where do they go to find male role models or additional role models for their young sons?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. In my experience, definitely some of those single moms have, brothers or, uncles of the kids that can sort of step into those roles. But I think like looking into community centers, Boys and Girls Club, things like that, that may sort of connect boys with sort of mentors and opportunities to see, males engaging and sort of being engaged in positive aspects in the community. That those are some examples of that. But I think most of the time, there are positive male role models in the families of those systems. And so those are great ways to sort of have that connection within the family that they can be able to sort of reach out to in terms of being able to provide sort of a model of sort of being a man and sort of what that means in terms of concerns that the mom may have about, is she sort of not sort of engaging with her son in a way that is going to sort of strengthen him. And again, as I stated earlier, I think that for most single moms, I would not say that the majority of them have concerns about that, but definitely I've had situations where some moms have, expressed challenges about being able to, or fears about raising a son without having that sort of role model.
Do you think that concern is just as great for young girls? That I'm concerned about my daughter not having a male role model?
That is a great question. And I think just in my own personal experience, I don't recall like a situation coming up where a single mom expressed concerns about not having the father or biological father present in terms of raising the girl, which I think is definitely interesting. And I mean, I don't know the reason for that. I think my only sort of conclusion that I can come to from that is that they feel like they can be that sort of model of what it means to be a woman, and maybe that's sort of being overly restrictive in terms of how we think about gender socialization,
Mm-hmm.
outside of thinking about what is the importance of having sort of a male figure or father to sort of raise a daughter, which I know that there are definitely discussions around the importance of that for girls, but this is something I've never really thought about, but I don't recall any sort of single mom expressing a concern about that raising.
Yeah. What do you think about that now that you're answering that and you're thinking about that and in all of your work, and that you don't recall any mothers expressing that concern?
Yeah, I think just off the sort of thinking aloud is that we don't really sort of typically think about what is the impact of the father in terms of the daughters.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, and we know, there's definitely a lot of emphasis in terms of thinking about what does that mean for daughters, and definitely we can probably identify movies I can think of off the top of my head, but definitely I'm pretty sure we've all probably seen a movie where adult woman has sort of expressed some sort of desire to like have a closer connection with her father and sort of what that means for her as a woman. And so we know that it does have an impact in terms of that individual. But I would be curious, and I don't know what the research is on sort of looking at that, but about why single moms particularly are not as concerned about sort of not having a father in the home in terms
Right.
of addressing the
Right. And
of the daughter.
absolutely. And I don't want to neglect the fathers who are single parenting, but I do want to be clear, because you said that most of your experience was with single mother ran homes.
Right.
And so I don't know if you would be comfortable speaking on that with the question reversed. Excuse me, are fathers as concerned about female role models or male role models for their children as well?
Yeah. Just in my own personal experience, it's probably been a handful of single fathers that I've worked with. Um, and I don't know, I guess preface this with in terms of single moms too, is that sometimes this sort of nature of being a single parent, mom or dad, may have to do with co-parenting situations.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a divorce or something like that, and so they are now the primary sort of caregiver for the child.
Mm.
Um, it, and sometimes that's for the benefit in terms of if the parents don't have a good relationship and they don't communicate well, it's probably not as healthy if they were sort of co-parenting, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have been in situations where either mom or dad has sort of, they're separated, and then they're sort of the primary person for raising the child. And I would say in those situations, if it has been a single father, at least in my own work, others may have sort of different experiences. Primarily, I would say it's been a single father with a son. I don't, in my own work experience, remember any sort of single dads raising daughters. And so I don't know if that sort of plays into when parents decide to not be together, that, there are experiences where, boys go with dads and daughters, go with moms. And so I don't know if that sort of plays into some of those previous situations. I don't recall having a conversation specifically with the parents about that and sort of what decisions were made about that, or if there were other situations. And definitely in some of my experiences, there's been some substance use on the part of a parent, and so that may have sort of resulted in them not being in that sort of caregiving role.
Mm-hmm.
And And so I think there are some challenges that sort of come along with that. But in terms of my own personal experience, I've not had a lot of situations where dads have been concerned about mom not being at the home, and maybe it's a part of thinking about it's easier to have a female caregiver that is not biological in terms of maybe like a grandmother or aunt that sometimes steps into that role when it is a single father. Maybe that they have that sort of additional support system that sometimes is maybe not always there, or maybe moms don't feel like it's even though they may have grandparents or others that may be involved. So I think it is sort of an interesting dynamic when you think about some of the gender dynamics that may play into some of that.
Absolutely. And as you were talking, one of the dynamics that I don't think we've even addressed, but that came to my mind was the fact that in your experience, and back when I was a researcher, which I don't do it too much anymore unless I'm specifically looking at a presentation on a topic. But as you were talking, you were saying that you've worked more with single mothers, more with single fathers. And from what I remember, the research, there are more single mothers than there are single fathers. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on why there are more single mothers?
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know. But I think that there are situations where maybe moms decide that they don't want fathers involved.
What does that mean?
In terms of maybe you didn't have a good relationship with your son's father, and so you sort of don't want them to have any contact with them because maybe you don't. Either you just have a bad relationship and just doesn't want the child to sort of have that relationship with the parent, which is definitely unfair to the child.
Yeah.
Or there are other potential, I guess, situations where you just feel like he's not a good role model for your son, and so you maybe not want him to be involved. But again, these are not sort of conversations that I've actively had with families that I've worked with, so I don't sort of know the research well enough in terms of like parenting of a single child to sort of understand what maybe some other explanations of that, if that sort of makes sense.
Absolutely. And it's just, excuse me, it's just been interesting to me as I'm thinking about it, just, both in my work in the past and both in my just everyday life. I don't really see too many single fathers. I'm not saying that they're not there. I'm just saying that it's usually less of an occurrence to me in my experience. But I also wanted to ask you, you were speaking a lot about, prior to us moving on to this, you were speaking about the oppositional defiance that we see in young children. In inner cities who are coming from single parent homes. What happens to that as they grow older? Can you talk a little bit about what happens with the oppositional defiance? What are you in your work? What have you seen happen that with children who have had issues with that?
Yeah, well, I think so. Typically, when kids develop oppositional defiant difficulties, or if they have a formal diagnosis as a child, most of the kids tend to outgrow those oppositional behaviors by adolescence and into adulthood. But there are a small percentage of those that go on to have other difficulties in adulthood with rule breaking sort of behaviors and may sort of end up in developing sort of criminal behaviors or getting involved in the criminal justice system. That's sort of a small percentage. And so for me, one of the sort of benefits is sort of seeking out therapy early on to sort of at least get what I like to say is sort of a check-in like we do when we go to the medical doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of see, are these things that are sort of typically developing? I mean, all kids are going to be a little bit sort of defiant and break some rules, but sort of has it reached that sort of level of being sort of headed towards a diagnosis of being extremely sort of problematic. And I think those are sometimes things that sometimes as a parent, particularly if you only have one child and you don't have any other kids that you sort of have raised, is that you don't really know, are these oppositional behaviors that my child is developing when they are in their early childhood sort of typical?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of parents
Absolutely.
assume that, well, my kid is automatically going to grow out of some of these things, and they
Mm-hmm.
sort of seek help. And so I always, one of the reasons that I really got into social media related to psychology stuff is really sort of providing some sort of resources and educational information for parents about sort of different mental health conditions and sort of understanding, like, when is this sort of problem, or when is this sort of something that just sort of, in response to some sort of experience that may be occurring in the sort of environment or in their life, is that you want to be able to sort of recognize if these things are starting to occur more frequently than not, then you really do want to at least sort of go see a mental health professional to sort of check in to see, is this something that my kid may be sort of experiencing, because maybe there is some sort of animosity because the other parent is not in the home, and so maybe they're angry at you. And so those could be things that you can sort of address and sort of have some family therapy and talk about those things. Or is this something that is sort of leading toward that development of being the oppositional defiant disorder?
Fair enough. And as you were talking about some of the differences too. What's normal and what's not. One of the things that came to my mind is, and I know you specifically work with children of color. And so one of the things that came to my mind, I think even before we even started talking, is how likely they are to receive a diagnosis, or how much more likely they are to be perceived as being oppositional and defiant if they're children of color, and two, if they have, what's your specialty, attention deficit disorder.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely children of color are oftentimes disadvantaged when it comes to how they are perceived in terms of their behavior. And I think there was a report, I don't remember, maybe 2 years ago, that came out. We're looking at like suspension rates among girls of color, and that they tend to be disproportionately suspended at a higher rate than their white peers. And so I think in school systems, definitely children of color are going to be perceived differently, not only by their peers, but also by adults and teachers specifically. And so as a parent, sometimes that doesn't create the most welcoming environment for you to sort of be involved in sort of your child's education, if they are being perceived sort of negatively, and sort of that your child is maybe different than how they are being seen by others. And so that's another reason why I feel like it's really important that if you get these reports from schools, or if you notice some sort of changes in your child's behavior, is to sort of go get a check-in and make sure that, of course, it's a qualified mental health professional, so that that the information that you receive from them is going to be accurate in terms of if the child does have a diagnosis or doesn't have a diagnosis. If it is more sort of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder types of difficulties, or if it's more sort of consistent with oppositional defiant disorder. Because there is some overlap, as we know as professionals, that a lot of mental health disorders have very similar symptoms.
Yes.
So there is a potential for kids to be sort of misdiagnosed or overly diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, where they may be of color, as opposed to maybe, let's say, ADHD, if it is that diagnosis as opposed to ODD.
Fair enough. And That's a good point, man. That's something that's kind of crossed in my mind, definitely, especially working in the prison system, right? And you see a lot of people that are people of color for me that are overly diagnosed. And I know that in my research in the past, I know that with children of color, diagnoses are usually much more heavily handed down to them, or they're overly diagnosed with something, or can be perceived in a negative way when it's, like you said, it's something that the mother perceives. Oh, they'll just kind of grow out of that stuff. But I am curious, in your work with these children, has it been like longitudinal work where you've monitored or worked with them over time and you've kind of seen them go through stages, or is it just like you're kind of in there for a little bit and then that's it?
So I'm not sure I'm clear on like your question.
Well, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, let me break it down because I did go into a bunch of stuff. But in your work with these children and families, have you been working with them over time? Like, have you seen them at like different stages of development to see, do they in fact grow out of this, or do other problems develop, or do you just work with these families for the short term?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's a great question, and there is some sort of nature of seeing some families long term, but ideally my goal is for it to be short term. I want you to sort of work with me so that we can be able to identify what your challenges and difficulties are, and that we can be able to sort of give you or the child the skills to be able to sort of cope and manage difficulties. And so most of the time it is a sort of short-term situation. And so definitely on most of my clinical cases where I've had children or even adolescents occasionally that presented with some oppositional behaviors, is that we were able to sort of get into a situation where either if it's a younger child, giving the parent or working with the parent to develop sort of behavior management strategies to address the oppositional behavior of the child. And if it's a teenager or adolescent, being able to sort of address some of the dynamics of being able to appropriately set boundaries, but also give the teenager a little bit of room so that they can sort of learn, to be independent within sort of the means of appropriate, sort of developments and expectations. And then I think sort of having parents, particularly of adolescents or teenagers, address communication challenges oftentimes really goes a long way in terms of addressing some of the oppositional behavior, because it does allow the child as well as sort of the parent to take some perspective of the other person and really understand sort of what is the reason behind sort of them being oppositional. And oftentimes for teenagers is that, they're ready to grow up much sooner probably than the parents want them to be. And so sort of understanding what is the reason for having these rules and regulations as a kid, and how that leads over into your adulthood. And so I think for me, always sort of fostering that understanding with the child to understand that as you become an adult, your boss is now going to sort of give you certain rules when you're on your job.
Absolutely.
That you have to sort of think about when you're living in your parents' home as sort of being in that situation, or if there are expectations about, making good grades, is that, that's sort of your paycheck, so to speak, is how I like to phrase it when I work with families. Because when you're in the real world, there are going to be certain expectations. And so it's appropriate to sort of learn how to deal with those expectations during your young adult life to prepare for your future.
Okay. And that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that came to my mind as you were talking, and I don't know if this is something that has ever come up for you in your work with these single parent run families. Do you find that that's generational? For example, do you find that women who are single parents, like maybe their mothers were single parents, do you find that that happens more often than not?
There oftentimes is sort of like repeating of cycles. Um, and I think that sort of maybe sometimes leads moms to maybe have more concerns about um, raising a child on their own, is that maybe their father wasn't as involved as maybe they had liked or wanted them to be. And so if their son's father's not around, and sort of they want to sort of maybe break that cycle, so that may be something that sort of feeds into that additional concern. Um,
Hmm.
but I do think that for a lot of people, like we learn um, during our childhood different models or schemas about what the world is, and so we tend to sort of repeat those things in terms of what's our own outlook in life. And so I think it's really important that we really sort of do address those needs. And I think it's great, and I always try to be really supportive and encouraging of single parents when they do sort of seek help, to sort of let them know like this is a good thing that you're doing, to really sort of address these needs outside of the fact that whether it may be sort of trying to get out of maybe this cyclical cycle of unhealthy sort of
Yeah.
relationships and boundaries. But I think for a lot of people that it's always great to be able to do that.
What are your thoughts on why those cycles continue, those generational cycles continue? Out.
I think it's just, we learn from what's in our environment.
Mm-hmm.
We see that, and we oftentimes assume that this is normal or this is okay, this is acceptable. And I think I was on a sort of an off topic. I was listening to the radio this morning, and they were talking about sort of some cyclical stuff and sort of repeating cycles. And the person that was relaying a story about their own childhood, and how, certain dynamics of their own family related to like physical abuse, was that they were taught that, abuse was okay as a child. And so
Mm-hmm.
trying to believe certain things as an adult. And of course, later they, the light bulb, so to speak, went off, and they realized this is not okay. But I think as kids, we don't know anything unless it's sort of what we're exposed to and sort of what we're taught. And so we see certain things, and we pick up on sort of the nature of that. This is normal, or we're told that this is normal. And so I think that's why that often sort of repeats itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm also curious too, about the question, how much are parents concerned with exposing their children to same sex role models? How important is it for little girls, or same or different sex role models? How important is it for little girls to understand how to build a healthy relationship with a man, and vice versa for boys?
Right.
How important, and I think, I wonder, that question, or that particular thought not coming up in a lot of those families, how much that kind of stuff plays into generational cycles.
Yeah, I mean that definitely, I think, is a good point. It really goes back to what you were saying earlier, um, about that it's not often that there are concerns about raising a daughter as a single parent, but that there are some dynamics in terms of like understanding healthy, relationships that are
Absolutely.
beneficial to sort of
Mm.
expose kids to at that age in terms of understanding that. And I think for me, in terms of my work that I've been doing is sort of discussions around masculinity and sort of how we think about masculinity. And one of the conversations that I often sort of have is that we often sort of think about this really restrictive role of masculinity. When boys are young, it's not okay to cry. You shouldn't talk about your feelings. But then when they become adults or they become men, women in relationships want them to sort of be able to express their emotions and talk
Yeah.
about their feelings. And I think that it's really unfair at that point to sort of, if they haven't been exposed to those things or have been socialized at a young age that it's okay to talk about your feelings, then we sort of flip the script when they're adults, that it sort of leads to a really difficult dynamic for them as men or young men, to sort of be comfortable and confident to be able to do that when most of their life, and this is not, of course, always the case, but that they're taught that it's not okay to sort of talk about your feelings and
Yeah.
emotions. You have to be tough. But then in adulthood, you sort of want the opposite of that. And so I think we sort of have to think about ways that we can sort of foster that in young boys as well, in terms of talking about the emotions, and that it's okay if you get emotional. I mean, it's a natural human emotion, right? And so I think we sometimes try to turn those things off when we're not biologically made to do that, which can, of course, lead to sort of unhealthy dynamics over the course of your life if you can't manage it and sort of cope with emotional experiences that you may have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, Dr. Turner, you've been wonderful. Just one last question for you. Do you have any suggestions in terms of resources or places that people can go if they're more interested in learning about, single parenting or how to address some of the stuff that you and I've talked about today?
Yeah, so one resource is there is a website that is managed by the Society of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, called effectivechildtherapy.org. That is one website that provides a lot of information related to not just single parenting, but different mental health difficulties or challenges or concerns that people may have for their child in terms of dealing with bullying and suicide and depression, mood swings. All of the information on that website is really helpful, again, in terms of identifying, what are some of the challenges that may be sort of typical for kids, but also what may be some sort of general tips about managing that, but also how you can find resources in terms of looking for mental health providers if you're interested in that, or if you feel like it's appropriate, as I mentioned, to sort of get a check-in. So that's one resource, effectivechildtherapy.org. And then for parents that may be interested in books, there is one book specifically about raising boys that's titled Boys into Men, Raising African American Teenage Sons. And that's by Nancy Boyd Franklin and a couple of other authors. And so that book, you can probably purchase it online at a number of different book outlets. And it provides some really interesting information about sort of how do you raise boys in this society, specifically dealing with issues like, racism and what are sort of healthy ways to sort of cope with that. And also how do you, address communication issues and develop positive identity when, oftentimes society is sort of up against you just based upon your skin color and who you are. So I think that may be a particularly helpful book for parents that may be interested in sort of raising boys.
Yes, absolutely wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for that. And where can people find you if they want to reach out to you, ask you questions, follow you, or they're impressed by what you say and they want to share a few kind words with you?
Yeah, so you can find me on both Twitter and Instagram at Dr. Earl Turner. It's the same name there. I also have a Facebook page, Dr. Earl Turner, as well, where I will post information and resources related to mental health and parenting as well. And if I have any blog posts, those will be shared on my social media accounts as well, so they can look into those pages. And that's Dr. Earl Turner on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Fair enough. And are there any events or projects or things that are coming up with you that my audience can support you on, or do you have anything that you've done that you could use support on?
Yeah, so I'm actually will be releasing the first episode of my podcast in 2019. So in late January, early February, depending on
Right.
everything is ready to go. But that podcast is The Breakdown with Dr. Earl. You can actually find it in iTunes, and it's also on SoundCloud. The Breakdown with Dr. Earl. And I will be discussing topics related to parenting as well as issues on boys and men. So I'm really excited about that particular project. So if you are interested in, questions and discussing those issues more in general, feel free to definitely follow me on social media at Dr. Earl Turner. And I will be sharing information about how you can get connected to the episodes for my podcast when it is released next year.
That's awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time here. It's been a wonderful talking to you.
Great. Thank you for having me, Dr. Natalie.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So you just heard the show with Dr. Earl, and I think it was a great show, great discussion, very inquisitive questions, and I appreciate the information that he gave. So let me know what you think at adatewithdarkness@gmail.com. Also, please be sure to join me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Definitely make sure you join the Facebook community where you join a tribe of other people who are very supportive and are also in the healing stages from their relationships with emotionally abusive and narcissistic individuals. Please remember to like, love, share, rate, and review my podcast so that other listeners may find it. I always appreciate spending time with you, learning something and talking about something, a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. So until next time, be well and take care.